Hello everyone, peace be upon you. Before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and stay with me until the end of the story. Also, leave a comment telling me which city and country you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my story has reached. For those of you who have already subscribed, I sincerely wish you good health, ease in all your affairs, abundant blessings, and may all your hopes and dreams come true. Amen. Now, let's begin the story. Natalie woke to the morning at Pier 47, the salt air sharp and familiar. Her routine was precise: run, coffee at Harborview Diner, check the cameras. Small rituals kept the old life manageable. She moved through Seabridge with a practiced calm. The town's quiet hid rough edges. People called her Nat. She taught self-defense twice a week and kept to a few friends. Derek dropped by the diner most days, a steady presence. Conversations between them were sparse and reliable. Megan, the young waitress, worked with focus, hands that sometimes trembled when the room felt loud. Grant Maddox's name was a shadow in town. He led a motor crowd that loved noise and intimidation. For weeks their rides had been posturing, engines, leather, loud music. Most folks looked away. Nat watched. The gang's swagger pressed at the town's edges like a test. One evening the pressure found an opening. At the diner, a table of three grew meaner with each drink. Tyler, Cole, Shane leaned into a waitress passing by. Megan froze, offering a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Nat saw the moment as clearly as a map. She stood and walked over, voice low, "Leave her alone." The largest man scoffed. People shifted, waiting. The shove was casual but intentional. It lit something in Natalie that no one in Seabridge had seen for years. She moved without noise, precise and measured. The man hit the floor before he understood it. The others lunged and she used their motions against them. Each shift was economy, not rage. The diner went quiet like a held breath. Someone filmed on a phone. Papers would call her a vigilante later, others would call her hero. Natalie only thought of the girl at the counter and the simple fact that some people needed someone to step in. After the men left, humiliated, the town's surface changed. The air seemed thinner. Nat felt it too, an old life pressing back in. As she walked home the night smelled of sea and something else, trouble remembered. She thought of routes, cameras, blind spots. Derek texted, "You okay?" She replied yes. Under Seabridge's quiet, a current had started. Whatever came next would be louder than a shove. Nat knew it couldn't be about pride. It would be about protection. Next morning the video was everywhere. Neighbors whispered, strangers called her a hero. Natalie ignored noise and cataloged facts, faces, bike models, likely hangouts. She made a checklist: cameras, motion sensors, extra locks, and felt preparation settle like armor, but threats didn't wait for perfect plans. The video had already spread by the time Nat finished bolting extra locks. It crawled through feeds and talk shows, picked over by people who loved a spectacle. Grant Maddox watched the clip in his garage the way a man watches a map of insult. He wasn't just a bruiser, he ran networks, favors, and men who liked proving a point with noise and teeth. Pride wasn't his only business, fear and control were. That afternoon a black sedan circled the block twice and then parked in a shadowed lane. Nat noticed it because she always noticed the things other people didn't. She noticed license plates, the way a hood sat over a driver's eyes, the way a radio hissed too loudly. She texted Derek a location and a one-word update: watching. His reply came fast, steady, "Stay ready." She went about her day like a woman carrying tools in invisible pockets, mental checklists running like gear in a well-oiled machine. But the town's veneer shifted. Megan started calling Nat's line between shifts, voice too high and fast. People who had only nodded at the diner now stopped to ask if Nat was okay, as if she could break. The local cop she trusted, an older man with more patience than resources, offered a thin kind of help, notebooks and suggestions, but his department had limits. The gang had reach. That reality pressed like humidity. Then the first real escalation came. The diner windows were keyed one night, small, deliberate scratches that could be catalogued or dismissed, depending on how brave the town felt. A message scribbled on a napkin slid under Nat's door was worse. No fingerprints, just ink and a threat that smelled of coordination. "You embarrassed us," it said. "You'll learn." Threats sharpened the air. Nat didn't call it fear. She called it a fact that required handling. She increased patrols of her own in quiet, shaping movements that wouldn't spook neighbors but would catch a man like Maddox off balance. Derek and two old teammates she trusted met at Pier 47 at dawn to sketch possibilities. Their talk was practical: timing, routes, who might be watching which cameras. They built layers, redundancy, and a chain of signals. Nat found calm in the planning. It was what she knew how to do. But calm didn't mean she let the emotional weight go. Anger and memory hovered at the edges, an old current that rose when she thought of Megan's small hands shaking behind the counter. Maddox kept testing. Motorcycles passed her block at odd hours, lights cutting the dark, engines loud like threats. A sedan idled too near the diner, a man staring at Megan as she took out the trash. Once, a stranger leaned too long at the counter, a hand close to his waistband, an attempt at intimidation that made Nat's jaw tighten. Each incident was a notch in a pattern that had shape and motive. Then came the call that sliced through preparation, Megan's voice, thin and terrified. "They've taken me," she whispered. "They said you'd come." That single line rearranged priorities. Everything else narrowed into a single, bright point. Nat left a note for neighbors, grabbed a small bag, and moved with the stealth of someone who had rehearsed exits 1,000 times. Derek met her 2 blocks away, breath steady, eyes raw with the same focus. The Rust Trail warehouse sat like a rotten tooth along the docks, windows boarded, doors rusted. From across the lot Nat watched guards shift, heard muffled laughter and the scrape of hands on metal. They were not careful men, they were confident. Confidence could be exploited. Nat used shadows, steps measured to avoid loose gravel, and the low hum of harbor machinery to mask her movement. She watched 3 men on rotation, cigarette embers dull in the night. Her pulse matched a rhythm she'd known for years: scan, assess, act. Inside, the place smelled of oil and neglect. Megan was bound but breathing, eyes wide and relieved to see Nat. The rescue was small and precise, moves that minimized noise and maximized control. 2 men fell without ever knowing what hit them, a third slumped in a heap after Nat used momentum against weight. No theatrics, no wasted force. Once outside with Megan safe in an alley under a single flickering light, Nat leaned close and said, "Tell me everything," but Megan could only sob. The rescue was a victory, yes, but it was also a message. Maddox would hear it and he would answer. Back at the safe house, Nat catalogued faces, tattoos, motor plates, and snippets of conversation. She handed lists to Derek and set signals for real-time updates. The night air felt thin but clearer. She hadn't taken the bait to go loud, and yet she'd made her stand. The trade-off was obvious: the world now knew she could reach into their darkness. That knowledge came with consequences. The next move wouldn't be petty vandalism or circling sedans. It would be escalation, and Nat knew it. She tightened the straps on the armor she wore in daylight and the one she fashioned in shadows, and waited for the shape of Maddox's retaliation to appear. It arrived faster than anyone expected. The morning after the rescue, Nat found her truck burned to a skeleton in the driveway, black glass scattered like broken promises. The neighborhood woke to smoke and sirens, neighbors clustered on their lawns, whispering theories. Nat stood in the kitchen with a coffee gone cold, watching the smoke curl into the sky. She felt the old familiar weight settle in her shoulders, not fear so much as the gravity of escalation. This was no longer about a shove or a prank. It was a message written in fire. Derek showed up 5 minutes after she texted. He didn't ask much. He walked the perimeter with a steady gait, scanning, calling out details like he read a room. Together they moved through a checklist they'd already rehearsed: cameras, witnesses, exits. They logged plates, pulled footage, and made calls to people who owed them favors. The department was helpful in its own way, but Nat had learned not to rely entirely on polite bureaucracy. She needed options, redundancy, and swift moves. Maddox doubled down. Flyers appeared in alleys, blurry photos of Nat with slurs and veiled threats. A small shop window that had been friendly to Nat was smashed in broad daylight. Motorcycles passed too close to the diner, loud and designed to intimidate. Every action was a test, a way to measure how far Nat would go before she snapped back. She didn't snap. She tightened. She and Derek started to push back in ways that didn't invite headlines. They set traps for information, anonymous calls to known hangouts, monitored online chatter, a quiet driver who would follow certain bikes at a respectful distance. Nat trained with a focus that surprised even her old instructor friends. She ran drills not because she wanted violence, but because she wanted certainty, certainty that if violence came, it would be controlled, limited, and purposeful. Megan tried to return to work but flinched at every engine. Nat spent hours rebuilding the girl's confidence, running quick situational drills behind the diner while the morning crowd pretended not to notice. The girl learned to move, to look, to assert a presence that made predators pause. It was small victories, tiny stitches against a tearing fabric. Then the pressure shifted. A man Nat recognized from the warehouse was seen with Maddox in a bar near Red Rock Ridge, bragging about the lesson they'd taught the town. Nat and Derek watched from a parked van, notes in hand. Their plan moved from reactive to proactive. They identified patterns, the times the gang met, the routes they used, the quiet lot where they stashed motorcycles. With that came options, and with options came risk. Risk showed up 2 nights later when they tried a recon of the lot. A trap snapped. Nat's phone buzzed in her hand with an alert: movement detected. They watched as headlights cut through the dark. A pair of bikes moved toward their position. Nat had a half-second to decide whether to vanish or engage. She chose engaged, not to fight, but to test. They pulled back, watched, and recorded. The bikes slowed, then sped up, and someone threw a bottle near the van. It shattered. The message was clear: leave or be owned by fear. That night Nat couldn't sleep. She walked the perimeter of her property, hands in pockets, eyes on the sea. She thought of choices, of how far to push, of the line between defense and retaliation. Derek slept in his truck nearby. He had been there since dawn and would be there until the dust settled. They weren't alone. A few others from her old life slid back into the circle, quiet, competent, willing to do what needed doing. Over the next days their actions escalated in a chess game of small moves: bait one night, diversion the next, public presence at the diner to show the town they wouldn't bend. Nat began to see the gang's strength as structure rather than myth, men who relied on noise and fear to hide weakness. They were dangerous, but predictable. That predictability became a weapon. Still, the cost became personal. An elderly neighbor found graffiti on her fence designed to unnerve the entire block. Megan got shoved again in a parking lot, bruises hidden by a jacket. The town's easy rhythm frayed. Nat's classes filled with women who wanted to learn more than stance and strike. They wanted to understand how to be calm in a storm. She taught them the smallest things: how to reclaim space, how to move with purpose, and each class felt like preparation for a confrontation that kept getting closer. On a rain-soaked evening, as Nat walked home from a late session, a motorcycle cut her off. 2 figures blocked the sidewalk. Voices were low and menacing. Nat's hand brushed the inside of her jacket where a small tactical knife sat folded. For a moment the world narrowed to breathing and the wet smell of tar. She didn't draw the knife. She didn't need to. Her presence, the way she shifted weight and met the tallest's eyes, was enough. They backed off, engines revving retaliation into the night. The game had changed. Maddox was no longer simply sending messages, he was committing pieces to a larger plan. Nat had bought time, saved Megan, and forced some hesitation. But the gang's resources were still vast, and pride is a poor currency in the pockets of men who congregate around power. Choices loomed like dark tide lines on the horizon: continue peeling back their network and risk more lives, or step into a final move that might end everything. Nat knew the morality of a last move was complicated. She also knew what she owed to those who couldn't defend themselves, and that knowledge narrowed everything to a single inevitable choice. The night before the planned confrontation, Nat barely slept. She walked the house, checked the cameras, tested the doors, and then sat at the kitchen table with a map spread out like a battlefield plan. Derek and the two vets, quiet, steady, arrived before dawn. Their faces were set, not eager for violence but ready to execute what had to be done. The plan was simple in its cruelty: take away Maddox's advantage, isolate his command, cut off his escape, and force a surrender with as little bloodshed as possible. Simple to describe, hard to make real. They moved like a team that had rehearsed this in a dozen different countries. Nat watched them prep with a calm that felt rehearsed into her bones. They staged at 3 points around Red Rock Ridge where Maddox's men gathered. Cameras were live, radios on low, signals agreed. Nat's role was to be the ghost that pushed Maddox into the space they controlled. Derek would take the north approach, the two vets would cut the south, and Nat would work the line between: fast, precise, surgical. The sun hadn't fully risen when engines started. It was a sound that had become a threat and now, perversely, a tool. Maddox rolled out with more men than they'd expected, a show of force meant to intimidate, meant to end things on his terms. He didn't know the terrain as they did. He didn't know Nat had reread his moves and counted his loyalists. He didn't know she had patience to wait until the trap was right. The first collision was kinetic and ugly. Bikes thundered down the ridge road and into stalls set by the team. Hidden obstacles forced sudden braking, a few men tumbled, more disoriented than hurt. Maddox's voice cut through, orders barked and curses, but the controlled chaos favored the prepared. Nat intercepted the first group, moving like a shadow, redirecting momentum and pairing restraint with speed. When a man swung a fist at her, she used his aggression against him, not to spite but to disable. Every motion was rehearsal and memory, practiced enough that force was precise, not vengeful. It was brutal and clinical. The two vets moved like walls, using batons and holds to stop advances without lethal force. Derek covered an exposed flank, cuffing men who were too stunned to resist. The tide turned in minutes that felt like hours. Maddox realized he had been baited and lashed out, furious and reckless. He charged toward Nat with a howl, all bluster and weight. She met him without hesitation, no theatrics, only the cold calculus of containment. His size was a weapon, but discipline was a better one. She read his momentum, stepped into it, and used it to pin him against a rusted railing until Derek closed the gap and secured him. It should have ended there. Law enforcement moved in on their call, subdued men who were more frightened than brave, and took statements as the morning gaped open. But the aftermath left marks. Men were injured, bruises and cuts telling the story of a night that could have gone darker. A neighbor's car had been dented, a shop window cracked in the shuffle. Nat felt each consequence like a stone in her shoe, necessary discomforts to keep a community safe, but still discomforts. In the tug after, Maddox screamed accusations as they led him away, rage warping his features. He swore vengeance in words that were brittle with defeat. Nat watched him from the edge of the crowd, breathing slow, the adrenaline ebbing and leaving fatigue that felt familiar. She'd chosen to act decisively because hesitation had become the town's enemy. The men she'd protected hugged, cried, and tried to sort out coffee and gratitude amid sirens and reporters. For Nat it was quieter. She scheduled debriefs, turned footage over to the police, and set up stricter watch rotations with Derek. What lingered was not the victory but the cost. The line between justice and vengeance had blurred in the storm of engines and shouts. Nat knew how easy it would have been to let fury run unchecked, to make Maddox pay beyond law. She'd kept to a standard: control, minimize harm, protect the innocent. That standard held even as she wrestled with the way the town now looked at her, some eyes grateful, some fearful, some hungry for spectacle. She'd changed the balance in Seabridge, but the change wasn't a clean thing. It left scars that would have to be healed. When the dust settled and the patrols thinned, Nat found Megan in the diner, hands steady as she set down a cup of coffee. They didn't say much at first. Gratitude hovered, awkward and immense. Derek clapped Nat on the shoulder and she let out a small, exhausted laugh. The team checked gear, folded up radios, and quietly took their leave. Law would take Maddox, and the town would breathe easier for a while. Nat stepped outside, looked at the water and felt the weight of responsibility shift but not disappear. The night had been won, but the war for peace was ongoing. She had acted, and now she would teach, rebuild, and keep watch, because someone had to. The days after the confrontation moved in a quieter rhythm, as if the whole town were catching its breath. Police presence remained higher for a while. Officers came by with updates, paperwork, and a cautious gratitude. Maddox had been booked, charges filed, and the court process began its slow, methodical grind. That didn't erase what happened, but it created a frame around it, a legal answer to a violent night that had felt like a private war. Nat found purpose in the small, steady tasks. She spent mornings with the cameras, going through footage with the detective assigned to the case, flagging faces and timelines, handing over what they needed. The evidence she'd gathered, plates, conversations, the rescue video, gave the law more than rumor. It mattered. She met with prosecutors once, again to be precise and factual, not theatrical. Justice was paperwork, it turned out, and patience. She learned to treat it like another mission, methodical, unglamorous, necessary. The community's reaction shifted over weeks. Fear's immediate edges softened into gratitude and curiosity. Harborview Diner got busier. People that had once turned their heads now sat down to eat and listen. Megan came back to steady shifts, her hands less shaky, smiles more natural. Nat spent long afternoons running small drills with her: how to move behind a counter, how to call for help without drawing attention, how to read a room. Those were the things that fixed people more than anything else, knowing they had tools and a way to use them. Her classes filled. Women of all ages signed up, not for aggression but for competence. Nat taught situational awareness, anchor points for escape, and how to use voices and body language to create distance. She kept the language simple and practical. She didn't dramatize. People came to feel safer because they could do something for themselves. Derek helped with secure transport for older students, and a few of Nat's old teammates volunteered quietly to run scenarios. It felt like the town was rebuilding not only its storefronts but also a muscle it had let atrophy: confidence. The media cycle spun and dimmed. Reporters called, briefly interested in the Navy SEAL neighbor angle, but the sensational headlines faded as court dates rolled in and life resumed. Nat didn't seek attention. She answered questions when necessary, corrected facts when they were wrong, and mostly let the record speak. The notoriety opened practical doors too: more donations for community safety projects, a small grant the diner used to improve lighting outside, and a partnership with local law enforcement to install a few more cameras around key areas. Emotionally, the healing was mixed. Nat felt the aftershocks, nights where she'd wake and check locks twice, a muscle memory that was hard to unlearn. But she also felt a steadier presence in her chest, the quiet that accompanies work done right. Megan's thanks was a daily thing now, but it was honest and without spectacle. The neighbors who had been distant offered casseroles and polite conversation. People chatted in the street without looking away. Those small acts mattered more than headlines. Court moved at its own pace. Maddox protested and pleaded, lawyers sparred, and eventually he faced sentencing that reflected a pattern of intimidation and escalation. It wasn't a neat vanquishing of an enemy, it was a legal accounting of harm. Nat watched from a distance, relief tempered by the knowledge that paperwork couldn't erase everything, but it could limit the man's ability to hurt others. By the time summer leaned into the edges of fall, Seabridge felt different but whole. Nat kept training, kept teaching, and occasionally walked the pier to clear her head. She maintained her house like a watch post but didn't live in it the way she had during the worst nights. Derek stopped by more often, not because of danger but because they'd reconnected over a work that mattered. The bond with the vets deepened into a quiet friendship that needed no explanation. The biggest change was less visible, a shift in how people responded to danger. Instead of turning away, they called, they helped, they stayed. Harborview Diner hung a small plaque near the door honoring community resilience. Megan placed it there with a steady hand. For Nat, the real resolution wasn't in headlines or arrests, it was in the mundane, a neighbor fixing a fence together, a woman walking home without flinching at every engine, a class full of people practicing exits. Those were the proofs that what she did mattered. She still expected clouds. She still checked cameras. But she also allowed herself small rituals, a morning coffee at the diner, quiet runs along the pier, and an occasional night of sleep uninterrupted. The town had scars, and so did she, but both could heal. There was work left, community meetings, ongoing training, and supporting Megan as she planned for college. Nat accepted those tasks as part of the life she'd chosen, steady, watchful, and useful. The crisis had changed things. It had also taught a stubborn lesson to everyone in Seabridge. Safety was not a spectator sport, it was work, a habit, a muscle people had to exercise together. In the weeks that followed the formalities, court dates, reports, and the slow bureaucratic closure, Seabridge found a quieter rhythm that felt earned. The plaque at Harborview Diner became less of a headline prop and more of a quiet reminder every time someone pushed through the door, we look out for one another. Nat watched that shift with a small, private satisfaction. She knew the visible threats had been contained for now, but the real victory was in how people responded afterward, slowly learning to notice, to call, to step in when it mattered. She still ran every morning at the pier, but it wasn't just to keep the edge honed. It was to keep a promise to herself that she wouldn't harden into someone who only waited for trouble. Training classes continued, but they evolved. What started as physical drills had grown into sessions about community vigilance, how to talk to a neighbor, how to document a suspicious plate, how to de-escalate a tense situation without making it worse. Megan came often, not just to practice but to help set up chairs, hand out water, and tell new students what it felt like to be on the receiving end of fear. Her voice had a steadiness now that was earned by nights she'd survived and by a woman who stepped forward on her behalf. Derek checked in more, not with plans or tactical briefings but with small things, a text about dinner, a joke about old gear, a quiet presence at the end of a long day. The vets who helped faded back to their own lives but stayed available, a network under the surface. Nat accepted that network as part of her new normal. She also accepted that some nights the afterimage of adrenaline would still wake her. Those were the nights she let herself feel what came, anger, exhaustion, and sometimes helplessness, then folded it into something practical the next morning. Maddox's sentencing arrived and, like most legal closures, it was complicated. The law did what law could, it removed him from the streets and began a process meant to keep him from doing harm again. It didn't erase the scars he'd caused, but it limited his reach. The town's response to that sentence held a mix of relief and wariness. People respected the court's role, and yet the real vigilance lived in daily acts, neighbors offering rides to those who felt unsafe at night, better lighting in alleys, a community watch that wasn't about hostility but about care. Nat took on a quieter role in all this. She met with local leaders, helped design a modest safety fund for emergencies, and liaised with prosecutors when new information surfaced. She made sure that evidence wasn't just collected and filed away, but used to prevent future harm. It was bureaucratic work, slow and often thankless, but it mattered. She also kept teaching the kids at the rec center how to be aware of their space, a generation that might grow up with different instincts because of the simple habit of looking out for each other. There were small, ordinary rewards. Megan got a scholarship application completed with Nat's help. The diner hosted a charity night that raised money for security improvements. A neighbor who once walked with his head down now waved across the street. Those things stacked up into a safer, softer town, not perfect, but better. Nat knew perfection wasn't the goal, resilience was. On a late afternoon at the pier, Nat and Derek stood looking at boats returning to their slips. The sun tilted low, and the sea was glassy. They didn't need many words. Derek tossed a small pebble into the water and said, "You did good, Nat." She let the compliment sit like a warm weight. "We did what needed doing," she said, which was true. The difference between those two lines was the people who'd shown up, Derek, the vets, Megan, the diner regulars who finally stopped turning away. As months passed, Nat let herself think about other things too, a trip further up the coast, a few quieter weekends, maybe a slow plan for a longer course to teach outside Seabridge. She still loved the discipline of readiness, but she also wanted to build a life where readiness didn't mean living in a state of perpetual alert. That balance was the new challenge, not to swing from vigilance into complacency, but to hold both, awareness without paranoia, preparedness without bitterness. In the end, the story Seabridge would tell itself wasn't only about a woman with a past who defended a town. It was about a community that learned how to protect itself and, in doing so, healed in small, meaningful ways. Nat stayed a guardian of sorts, but she was also a neighbor who bought milk, laughed at bad jokes in the diner, and sometimes let the tide wash away the tension she'd carried all those years. When she ran at dawn now, the town felt like something she and others had shaped together, messy, imperfect, but theirs. And that, she realized, was the point. Courage matters, but shared responsibility lasts.